Welcome to the Inquiring Spirit podcast. I'm Ravi Joseph. And
Hi, I'm Bharath.
yep, welcome Bharath. How are you doing this morning?
Good, good. How are you?
Good, thanks. So today you suggested a debate between Francis Fukuyama and John Gray, um, which we'll link in the show notes below about the future of liberalism and whether it still kind of holds as a political philosophy or if it is kind of obsolete for some reason, with Fukuyama kind of being the defender of liberalism, kind of as he's been the kind of that voice of defending liberalism since his book The End of History in the early 90s, and John Gray taking the kind of more skeptical position. So would you like to tell us why you brought this video in and what you found resonant about it?
Sure. Yeah, I think the what I found compelling about it is that I was kind of drawn recently to John Gray's writings, and one of the things that he's been articulating is that liberalism is sort of, and he's been saying this for 30 years, which is connected to this disagreement with Fukuyama, where in after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, Fukuyama's book was sort of seen as this great heralding of like the American liberal democracy picture has having won out, and that this is sort of now the what will triumph into the future, and that now that the Soviet Union has been defeated or collapsed, in the Cold War, America won the Cold War, and so basically now the 21st century will unfold with the American sort of empire or American vision of self-government becoming and capitalism becoming sort of the norm everywhere. And I think that has not panned out, right? And then I think uh, most notably, even in America now, there's a question of what kind of democracy we have, what kind of liberal democracy we have. There's, and let alone in other places. Russia didn't become liberal democratic. There are many different forms of government around the world. They didn't all fall in line with America. And Gray has been a very early sort of skeptic of this kind of optimistic vision of sort of the Western values spreading all around the world. And so I've been very interested in sort of like, why is that? What has he latched onto that he was able to sort of see this 30 years ago? And I think what he's sort of saying, which resonates to me, is that uh, fundamentally liberalism, which I think both he and Fukuyama generally kind of agree is sort of respect for rule of law, independent press, independent judiciary, the idea that people can have sort of the freedom to of speech, freedom of, the various freedoms that sort of we want to take for granted. That kind of setup is fundamentally not sort of just an ideal, but for on Gray's view, it is a kind of a way of life that just happened to come up, right? So it's a cultural event in the last 300 years of European civilization. And that as a cultural event, there's nothing that guarantees that this cultural event will continue, let alone spread to parts of the world with other cultures and other sort of contexts, right? So that in itself is already an interesting disagreement between Fukuyama and Gray, where for Fukuyama, liberalism is a kind of set of uh, ideals and set of practices, as he says in the video, that for him, liberalism is kind of an offshoot of Enlightenment scientific thinking, where we bring that kind of scientific mindset to politics and governance. Whereas for Gray, it's no, liberalism is sort of just a kind of historical creation in the West, which might survive or might not survive. And so we need to sort of think about it that way. I'll say one other thing about what I find compelling, which neither Fukuyama nor Gray talk about this. So which is, I think, for to me, a place where I disagree maybe with both of them. But is that to me the interesting question of whether liberalism will survive, say, in America in the way that it has existed, has a lot to do with uh, questions of multiculturalism and questions of sort of diversification of America. And so neither of them talk about it. They're both very critical of the woke mindset, which I am sympathetic with. I agree that, I think the woke thing has become kind of extreme. But it seems to me that the broader question is that the kind of democ liberal society that, say, I'll just limit myself to America right now. America had for 250 years was for the most part premised on a society that was culturally mainly dominated by sort of white men, right? So even though the ideals were amazing, the culture was not living up to those ideals. Whereas, especially in the last 75 years, since the civil rights movement, feminism, immigration opening up in the 1960s, America's sort of cultural fabric has changed. And I think Gray is absolutely right that liberalism as an ideal is fundamentally premised on the cultural foundation. And so to me, then there's a question of if the culture has changed, uh, will the same liberal principles from before continue, which is where basically we want to go from a kind of will we actually have a multicultural liberal democracy, or will multicultural uh, society uh, become somehow give up on liberalism because multiculturalism, for example, might be too chaotic. It might be too complex, too sort of disorienting for people, and they might feel like there's too many cultures, too many ways of living, too many options, and they might choose a form of government that kind of seeks to instill a certain uh, authority. Right. And so that's kind of where I see the issue coming, which they don't really address. But I think to me that sort of uh, fascinating. But I like the Gray's approach of treating liberalism as a cultural phenomenon and then thinking about its how much it might survive culturally, rather than trying to think about it in this abstract way of, okay, this is somehow a moral or a political philosophy insight that some people had, John Locke and, Kant and so forth, and then implemented by, Jefferson and John Adams and so on, uh, which seems, kind of disconnected from the cultural dimension of even all of those thinkers. So that's the kind of thing that I like about what Gray is saying.
Mm. Yeah, it's really interesting. Um, I think it's worth um, exploring why Fukuyama thinks that it is a kind of natural or inevitable development as opposed to um, not Locke's view, to Gray's view. Um, and this isn't really touched on in the video, but so one thing that Gray says is that liberalism is sort of this um, insight that science and technology have this progressive character that leads to kind of endless progress, and we'll see if that's actually endless or if there's some sort of natural limit to that. But so far, it's been pretty much a yeah, just a straight line, not a straight line, but a increase of progress in science and technology for the last couple of hundred years. And the question is whether that progress can be replicated in the ethical and political domains, which is the question
Right.
that Gray raised. And so for Gray, it's maybe not, maybe it's just this cultural little island of cultural experience that arises from time to time. So I think it's worth considering why Fukuyama thinks no, there's actually this process um, that leads to the development of um, of liberalism in the ethical political domain, and I'll also give a little critique of why I think it is has shown to be not necessarily um, accurate. And then I also wanted to comment on your point about multiculturalism, since that's really interesting. So the connection that Fukuyama saw between the science and technology domain and the kind of ethical psychological domain was that in addition to science and technology, there's also this like psychological phenomenon where there's a part of man's nature that seeks to see itself as having worth and value and is kind of spirited towards having that worth and value be recognized by others. So he borrowed Hegel's notion of recognition via Kojev, another philosopher, to say that, well, there's actually this psychological motor of history alongside the motor of history that science and technology kind of sets up, so that in addition to science and technology producing economic value, which by itself we might think just leads to authoritarian capitalism, um, like early South Korea or China. Um, yeah, instead of just leaning to authoritarian capitalism, it actually leads naturally to liberalism because when you yoke that economic progress to humans' desire to have themselves be seen as valuable and worthy, that actually leads to humans demanding equal rights between each other. And the natural endpoint of that is kind of the recognition of everybody as having equality. Um, and that is what provides the basis for this kind of system model that he laid out of liberalism being everybody having equal rights, autonomous individuals, protected by the rule of law. So the recognition is the kind of psychological motor that leads to that system of liberalism being actually the end state. Um, and so why I think that is incorrect is that I don't think it's true that recognition is adequately provided for just by the liberal system in the sense that people don't only want equality before the law. They consider, and that's not sufficient to satisfy their drive for recognition, but they seek recognition in all these other ways through uh, the business world and through um, different sorts of social dynamics. And we're seeing different ways that that can be brought out by this new technological situation where people seek for fame and status through social media. And there's no natural firewalling of that between the domains of um, kind of civil life and political life proper. So one idea that Fukuyama raises in the book is, well, maybe the business world is where we can set up a firewall between politics and business so that people just seek for recognition in the business world and it's not going to affect our political system. But actually, that doesn't seem to be true because Trump was a businessman before getting into politics, and there's this one kind of it's hard to tell how true this is, but there's this story that he was slighted by Obama at the press correspondence dinner, and then that is what kind of in this mythic fashion led to his megalomania being triggered and wanting to run for president. Um, Regardless of whether that's true, there's something like it true about how there was this lack of recognition that I think he felt. It's hard to get a model into his psychology because he's he's a hard person to read for me at least. Um, but yeah, there's this lack of recognition that he felt doing what he was doing, and so he decided to go into the political domain to start activating that. So there's no firewall between the business world and the political world. You can kind of translate your drive for recognition from business into politics. I think we're going to see that increasingly with different sorts of social media influencers wanting to translate their social media influence into the political realm. So political influencers, I think, will be a thing in the future. So I don't think that liberalism uh, adequately satisfies this drive for recognition, and it remains to be seen what will do that. So that's why I think that I think that's So along with Gray, I also think that there's not any natural reason to think that liberalism is the only possible way that we could organize our institutions and organize our society. I think um, there are going to be different possibilities opening up with technology that we have yet to see. I think that's just one vector of how institutions could be organized differently. Um, yeah, so but that's specifically a critique of Fukuyama's theory of why liberalism is the um, natural state. I also wanted to, so yeah, why I thought that was important to bring up is because if we're trying to understand why Gray, so why is it that Fukuyama sees liberalism as this um, kind of why is it that he sees this as a um, the end state of um, human government. It's because of these dynamics, but I gave a critique of why
Yeah.
I think that's wrong. And then so that lends possibility to Gray's view. Um, I'm not completely convinced by his view either. Maybe we'll go into that later. Because I think there are other dynamics that Gray neglects that could also still have a bearing on the fact of there being some trajectory, even if it's not towards liberalism. I think one interesting thing to bring in might be uh, the developmental psychology worldview, which I don't subscribe to fully, but I think has an interesting point, and that's brought in by Ken Wilber. So I just want to bookmark that um, for maybe to go into further. But let me briefly comment on your multiculturalism point because I think that was really interesting as well. Um, yeah, so when you were talking, I made this connection that this multiculturalism thing is actually kind of an extension um, of the question of religion, which liberalism kind of set up a compromise between that's kind of extended to these questions of whether cultural values wholesale can also be accommodated by this liberal compromise. So in the original liberal compromise, there were these words of religion, and liberalism was kind of instituted as saying like, let's be able to work together in this common framework. Um, of focusing on the rule of law and what we can do together as a culture constructively, and let's keep religion to its private domain. So the multicultural question is whether you can say that for cultural values wholesale. So whether you can say, um, well, let's leave cultural values wholesale in the private domain, and let's just focus on rule of law and all these political things that we need to get to be able to work together. Um, so I don't, um, yeah, I think there is this kind of thick layer of 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 cultural something that is needed to get liberalism to work correctly for all these things to work together, and whether that's conceived of as assimilation or whether that's conceived of as um, just like in education into the basic functionings of government. There's more needed than just a complete simulation of different cultures within this multicultural framework. And I think we're going to be figuring out what exactly the nature of that is, because like you're saying, society has been changing over the last, it's been changing continuously, but specifically the multicultural changes over the last 100 years bring that dimension into it. Um, yeah, so I'll stop there for now. Um, Curious your
Yeah,
thought.
I think uh, those are all great points. I think I sort of have a similar view that I think one of the ways I'll just maybe get at some of what you're saying in a slightly different way that I was thinking of, right? Is one of the things that I uh, maybe one way of thinking about the disagreement between Fukuyama and Gray can be seen by sort of Fukuyama was influenced by Isaiah Berlin. And this is something that I've gotten interested in. So one of the things so Isaiah Berlin was this sort of Russian, Jewish, British philosopher of the 20th century. And one of the things that I think, really powerfully brought out was that there is this sort of deep tension between Enlightenment values and Romanticism in the West, and that this kind of tension between Enlightenment and Romanticism was driving the political issues of the 20th century, right? So, and in one ways, Fukuyama, I think, is an Enlightenment thinker in that he thinks that people tend to be or can be, if people are being rational, then they will somehow come, they will basically come to the general liberal perspective that, okay, in a society, we want basic things like a functioning government, a good police, protection of property. All of this will require us sort of giving to others the freedoms that we want to have and respecting this. And so this is kind of a rational picture that we would accept. And and so that's, I think, is the way in which Fukuyama thinks if you bring this sort of scientific perspective to politics, you're bringing this kind of rational perspective to politics, right? And I think the romantic response is to say, well, but human beings aren't rational in that way. There is a kind of the scientific picture presupposes a certain kind of idealized rationality, which is great in the domain of science, right? But human beings are driven by identities, emotions, many other features, questions like precisely of recognition, of wanting not just equality even, but maybe having an upper hand, the will to power, the sort of assertion of one's sort of brute force on other people, right? Or resisting it or wanting to have sort of some kind of I think Nietzsche famously said that people take uh, uh, take glee in cruelty, when we don't talk about that enough, right? That there's a kind of like affirmation that I am great because I can sort of put my foot on your neck, kind of impulse. Which is, and I think it's very important. So the romantics, I think, we're sort of trying to grapple with that dimension of human life, that there's this kind of vast wellspring almost of the unconscious that there is to be dealt with. And I think I like you bringing in Ken Wilber, because to me that's the other thing that neither Fukuyama or Gray are really talking about, but which is really in the background of this, I think, is how does this relate to questions of, we could call it spirituality, but we could also call it sort of the general widening of human consciousness, and sort of uh, or of human transformation. How does politics relate to that kind of projects of, that were religious, kind of tech, usually in the past were religious projects. And I think one of the problems with liberalism has been that making the domain of religion, where we don't have, and the domain of sort of meaning creation, as it were, people living meaningful lives, not only rational lives. The meaning creation in liberalism had been rendered sort of private, right? And subjective almost in a certain way, that, okay, we have to sort of keep that private, that meaning creating part of us private, um, and function in society in a way that we say, okay, you can create meaning in your own way, I'll create it in my own way. What is the minimal state we need to enable that to happen? And I think Gray has been pointing out, following Berlin, I think rightly so, that this is a totally uh, this is very much in tension with human psychology, this picture. Just like the way that people might have thought that, say, communism was in tension with human psychology, that people are not going to sort of submit to sort of an authoritarian figure like Stalin, um, thinking, well, but because we're all going to be somehow equal, that at some point there is a sort of dimensions of human psychology that are going to get repressed in this way, which will come out and which will lash out, and we would need to figure out what to do with that. And I think that some version of that has been happening in the West for several hundred years. It isn't sort of new with current populism. It obviously happened in earlier forms of populism in the 20th century, even in the 19th century. Uh, and I think what we're seeing now is this kind of like clash between that kind of romantic desire to affirm identity in a robust, meaningful oriented way into the public domain. Um, and the liberalism sort of saying, no, but if you do that, then we're gonna basically have irresolvable clashes. And so we need to keep them somehow private. And now, but that liberal picture that Fukuyama is holding on to is really getting pummeled from the right and the left. I think the left doesn't want to keep it private because that is seen as an extension of patriarchy and racism. Sort of saying, keep your, if you're black or brown, keep your culture private, is how that is, I think, coming across. And it's like, no, yes, we have these rights. Yes, we can, there's no segregation, but there is this cultural segregation that is happening, and we want to break through the cultural segregation, is I think what a lot of the leftists are kind of being driven by, which I think has went in the woke direction. But I think that's the motivation behind it. And I think what's coming from the right is a similar kind of movement from either a kind of religious conservatism or even a non-religious, a lot of atheistic Christian, a lot of atheists who are culturally Christian or culturally, religious, who identify with the culture of their religious or background of various kinds, who want to bring that into the public domain. And I think you meant like, Trump is a great example of this, right? I think there's a sense in which his whole personality seems to be in the public domain. And that is something very, I think, energizing for people. Hey, this guy is resisting having his personality being put in a box. All right. The way that I think one imagines liberalism forcing that meaning dimension of us into the private realm. And we want to be able to sort of flex ourselves more into the public domain, especially as with the internet coming up, and we want to sort of not hide that stuff. And so I think Gray was rightly pointing out that, yes, that human dimension is going to clash with liberalism. And it's not obvious that sort of the way in which liberalism has sustained will continue, because there's this kind of clash of what do we do with this clash of maybe the rational and the romantic, the 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 part of it that says, yes, let's just think about how we can all get along so that we can all have our own private, meaningful projects and lives. But it turns out communal meaning is very fundamental to people. It's not just private meaning. And so once you have communal meaning is very fundamental to people, that immediately brings into question, well, what kind of a communal society are we going to have? And that, as you're saying rightly, totally cuts into the domain of politics. It's not going to be just business. It's not just going to be entertainment. It's not going to be religion here and politics here. All these things that have been segregated, religion, politics, religion, entertainment, uh, yeah, literature, so on and so forth. These things are kind of rushing in to this domain, especially with our new media. And I think that is sort of challenging liberalism in a very deep way.
Hmm. Yeah, I have to think about that a little further, how what you're saying about how the private and public domain of meaning um are kind of getting fused in these new tendencies. I have to think about this and see. Yeah, if you have any more examples of that, I'd love to hear them. Um, but I guess for now, I'll comment on your bring in the Enlightenment versus Romanticism um, idea, and I guess I'll take this um, as this kind of general idea of the reasonable versus the kind of non-rational or other than rational parts of the human being. And I think it's interesting because it cuts across both sides. It's not just that one of the left and the right now. It's not just that one side is the Enlightenment side and the other side is the non-Enlightenment side because
Right,
so
definitely.
there's been a lot of comments on how the Democrats are now kind of the establishment party and the party of kind of reasonable, responsible governance. But there's also this, I think the wokeness trend doesn't neatly fit into Enlightenment um, categories. It is in a certain sense um, a desire for progress, specifically in the direction of compassion, and to the point where it turns kind of intolerant. Um, but there's this kind of emotional component to the wokeness thing that I think is not that kind of exceeds the question of enlightenment rationality, I think. Um, so
Yeah,
uh
I think if I may just
yeah,
jump up for a second, I think that's really correct. One way to see that is that some of the greatest criticisms of the Enlightenment have come from the right, but also they've come from the left, yeah, even if you think about it intellectually or culturally, right? So a lot of the criticism of the left has been of, say, that the Enlightenment has been too Eurocentric. That's a great example of a criticism in that way, right? So this is kind of the problem that the Democrats are really facing, for which I think, you know, uh, I mean, I voted for Kamala Harris. I think of myself as a Democrat, right? But I think this is something that if I think, okay, what is it that Democrats need to really sort of figure out, right? Other than okay, resisting, to some extent, some of I would say the excesses of a Trump administration that sort of there is sort of that defensive project that the Democrats might have to do, but I don't want to be defined only by that defensive project. That's just a part of parcel of a democracy is there's always going to be a defensive project, but there should be a positive project, right? And the positive project uh, and I really don't want the Democrats to become kind of how I feel sometimes the Republicans become, which is that they just want to stop everything the Democrats are doing, and that's what they're defined by, right? And the positive project for the Democrats really is a question of how are they going to combine the 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 being the establishment, sort of Kamala Harris being very much becoming almost patriotic, right? There was a deep sense of sort of patriotism, holding forth American values, and so on and so forth, which I resonated with. Um, right. So did a lot of like McCain Republicans and so forth, right? But then there is a tension of, okay, a lot of the people on the left for the last 40 years uh, have been very critical precisely of also the Eurocentrism of the very Enlightenment values which are at the foundation of America, right? So there's a tension here, the tension of what do we make, there's a tension within the left about what do we make of these two things, right? And I think one of the reasons I think Kamala Harris didn't touch uh, that tension within the Democratic Party. And I mean, maybe she couldn't in the span of 3 months, right? But if there was a primary, I suspect this tension would have erupted in the Democratic side, right? And one version of that tension, which was, is the issue of what do the Democrats think about Israel-Palestine issue and so forth, right? This kind of it's a version of that tension, and I think Obama was a real fantasy for the Democrats that these two these two sides can sort of naturally and cohere with, because here is this very charismatic person who somehow seems to be trying to do both, right? And that the charisma will sort of be enough to combine the two things. And I think I worry about that approach. I don't think charisma is going to be enough to combine these things. I think there's a reckoning that has to happen about, what is the relation of these two issues. I feel like the Trump side has, for example, basically given up on this tension because they gave up on the Enlightenment vision of the understanding of the founding fathers. I think they just kind of have a kind of a fantasy picture of who the founding fathers are, because they're not tracking the fact that pretty much none of the founding fathers, or many of the founding fathers, were deists. They were not they were not traditional Christians. They did not envision America to be a Christian nation in that way, right? So they kind of combined that they dealt with this tension by sort of having a kind of imaginary picture of American history that they're much more drawn to, where they don't want to really hear about what were the actual ideas of George Washington and sort of Thomas Jefferson, uh, because I think they would find those ideas to be incredibly left, uh, incredibly woke, frankly, right? They would not resonate with the ideas if they exactly read a lot of the writings of those times, that these thinkers were articulating. These were not these people. Thomas Jefferson is much more in common, talks a lot more like Barack Obama than he does like Tucker Carlson, right? And so that so everybody has to make sense of this tension. Everybody has to make sense of what is the relation of the Enlightenment values to the romantic stuff. How much are we going to lean in the Enlightenment direction? But if you lean in the Enlightenment direction, what is our relation to these Enlightenment thinkers, who for the most part were all white men, right, at the founding of this nation? So what does that mean? And I kind of feel like I would like, that I think the Democrat, I hear Gray as sort of saying, hey, lean into this and think about this, figure this out, figure out this inner tension, and don't just assume liberalism will save the day, because liberalism is not set up to save the day. It is not, we can't take it for granted that way. Maybe we can create a new version of liberalism, but the only way to do that is to see clearly the deep tensions within liberalism that have been there all along. And we just can't assume, okay, it'll be fine, you know?
Mm. Um, yeah, interesting points there. Um, this tension between the Eurocentrism and the positive values brought forth by the Enlightenment versus the Eurocentrism on the other side. I want to bring up another dimension of this, um, which I think makes this narrative a little bit more complicated, which is the Enlightenment values that are still reflecting through on the right side that I think it make this a more complicated question than the Democrats are kind of the leading edge of Enlightenment versus non-enlight post-Enlightenment um, values. So there's this movement on the right side um, that we see in the conversion of certain technology figures to the pro-Trump side. And so I'm not, I think one of the things that resonates with them is this idea of like responsible governance and law and order, which is ironic because Trump's whole thing is like dismantling the establishment and and kind of wrecking all these federal institutions that have been um in place for decades. Um but there's this desire um for law and order to be enforced in kind of big cities that has not been done because there are tendencies on the Democratic side to pander um, to these ideas that law and order does not need to be enforced because there's various arguments for why that is on the Democratic side. But so what I see that reflect in the Enlightenment side is that these technology figures are still believing in this tradition of reason and progress in a way that I think the Democrats, even maybe the establishment Democrats, have kind of given up on. And so why they chose to ally themselves with Trump, and do they believe that Trump is going to be able to kind of bring all that about? It's a question. It's a questionable alliance, I think, but there's at least this drive on that side of things to believe that there are these aspects of the Enlightenment project that have been kind of abandoned by the left. That that their judgment is that there's no hope of seeing that aspect of the Enlightenment be able to continue on the left side because they've kind of attached themselves to these other values, um, and that the only way that the advancement of reason, scientific progress is going to happen is if it happens through the right side. So again, I'm kind of um, I yeah, I see something weird happening here, which is that like it's true that they will get like this narrow conception of technological progress, maybe um working through that side if they reduce certain regulations that are impeding certain forms of scientific research, but at the same time it's going to destroy a lot of the important parts of rule of law that and the institutional approach that has been developed on um, by keeping these federal institutions intact. So I'm skeptical that it will work out the way they see it, but there is this impulse towards um, yeah, preserving that part of the Enlightenment project that we don't see on the left. Um, so why I think this complicates things is um, yeah, I think there's not um, hmm. Yeah, it introduces this other set of questions about if the Enlightenment is just about equality and these things that you mentioned, these commonalities between and Obama talking about equality. That's one thing, but there's also this legacy of progress, scientific rationality um, that is also being carried out that um, are not in place that have not yet been had a chance to fully work themselves out. So I don't. Um, yeah, sorry, I'll stop there. I'm curious if you have any takes on that side of the equation because I think that's kind of left out in this question of the tension between equality and how that is kind of this tension between the Enlightenment approach and the post-Enlightenment approach that's happening on the left side. There's this other dynamic that is working itself out in another direction, which I think points to the kind of multivalent nature of progress um, that yeah, just this unidirectional idea doesn't take into account.
No, I think that's really right. I'm glad you raised that point, right? So yeah, I was kind of articulating this how to combine the Enlightenment and the Romantic, that the tension on the democratic side.
Mhm.
You know, it's clearly a tension on the Republican side as well. The person that I don't know, I guess uh, perhaps who you were thinking of in particular, but one person that occurred to me. I mean, there could be several different versions, right? I mean, there's a Tucker Carlson type of affirmation of the founding fathers kind of thing, enlightenment. But there's another version which I think maybe is like, so I think of somebody like Vivek Ramaswamy.
Mm.
I think so. To me, he seems uh, he would certainly articulate his defense of supporting Trump as going along with the Enlightenment project and sort of as a continuation of the founding fathers, because from what I saw when he was sort of running in the Republican primary, and also even when he was supporting Trump, sort of generally being very affirmative about the American sort of the American political project, and going back to the founding fathers in a certain way, and sort of going back, in a way that perhaps Trump himself is not really that concerned, right? Uh, but where there's a kind of synthesis from maybe the tech world with this kind of Enlightenment project, where there is a different picture of the way in which science and the scientific picture or is merged with politics, the way that, it might be for Fukuyama is one way they're coming together. And we can see Gray as somebody who's sort of generally skeptical that the Enlightenment and the Romantic can be brought together. Sorry, that the Enlightenment and sort of the scientific and the political can be brought together in this way, right? And I think but the fantasy that the scientific and the political can be brought together, which Fukuyama has its own sort of democratic version and its own Trumpist version as well. It does, it doesn't have to be the Fukuyama version, right? I think the Trump supporting version seems to be a synthesis. It seems to be like Elon Musk. It seems to be sort of emblematic of this. Is sort of highly super scientific guy who's obviously, is very sort of at the cutting edge of many of the ways in which science and technology are happening, and who sort of it's not somehow think I don't think he would sort of say, well, there's that side of me, and then there is sort of some, anti-woke side of me, which is the emotional side, and only the emotional side is supporting Trump. I think that wouldn't make any sense, right? For how somebody like Musk would think of his support of Trump. It would be something like the rational side is resisting the very side of him that can process how rockets function, is also for him probably inseparable from the part of him that is sort of critical of the woke, right? And that somehow all of that is what is great about America that he's trying to protect, right? And so, which I think in a different way, the challenge for the left is, how to sort of, which I think is what somebody like Robert Kennedy and so forth are critical of, right? It's like, I think for the left, like somebody like Dr. Fauci was a great example of where science and politics come together in a good way, the way they saw it, where you have expertise in the traditional sense merging with politics, and that is sort of what we need, right? And this clash, I think it's much better, it seems to me, to be having this conversation that there is a clash here between three different ways already. Here we have Fukuyama, we have Fauci, and we have, say, Elon Musk, right? Are different ways in which the scientific and the political are trying to get together, right? And for many, and I suspect, I don't think Fauci would think that he's a leftist of any kind. He's just trying to do his job. But I think he got put in a situation, the context made it seem hyper political. And so, but that is sort of generally the picture that now the Democrats are part of, the Democrats support expertise in a traditional sense, and want politics to somehow respect that kind of traditional expertise in journalism, in science, in education, and so forth. And so that's the sense in which I think you're right. They're kind of the party of the establishment now. And so I think it's worth having this debate just like that. It's worth having a debate of, well, what is the right way to combine the Enlightenment and the Romantic? What is the right way to combine politics and science, right? And not assume that any of these things are already decided and set in stone, but actually have these debates in these terms rather than in the terms of which is the evil side and which is the crazy side. And unfortunately, the way that things have gotten set up, it makes it really hard to have that. And I think that's kind of where we're at. I resonate with Fukuyama and Gray's conversation, but I can't help but feel that this is a kind of outdated mode of conversation they're having because it is so dispassionate, right? The dialogue is very like these two professor types having this conversation, sort of trying to sort of temper down emotions and trying to sort of tell everybody, guys, calm down, try to be rational, you know, and they're disagreeing with each other, but it's a very subtle disagreement because they're also agreeing about a lot of things and so forth. This is just not the space we're in anymore. And because the emotions are part of the conversation. And so I think we just need to figure out ways to have these debates without all of the emotions being triggered on. It's not only one side or the other. It's, yeah, we have like three, four, five different positions and sort of just having all of that conversation. And I think to do that, maybe we do need, maybe this, I would be curious to hear how you're thinking about Wilbur in this context, right? Because maybe we sort of need a different take on how to think about the whole terrain that isn't just political and that isn't just scientific, but trying to think about ways in which we can harness the scientific, rational, the emotional, the unconscious, the artistic, the spiritual sides, all of these things. How do we harmonize them? People who tend to think about that, for who people who have been engaged with that project might have an interesting lens to bring to our current political questions.
Hmm. Yeah, I was just about to bring up Wilbur actually, so thanks for that invitation. Yeah, I think this is interesting because it offers Wilbur's theory offers um a plausible I don't want to say plausible. It offers an explanation of why certain of these of this certain kind of developmental trajectory um but it's a little bit too neat and I wonder if um yeah, and that's why I'm a little bit skeptical of it.
Yeah,
Um
I worry about all the quadrants and it's
yeah,
like,
yeah. So that's why I have this kind of critical curiosity towards Wilbur, as it was pretty much been my stance for many years now. So what I mean by this is, so Fukuyama offered one kind of psychological explanation for this dynamic of why liberalism is this kind of natural evolution, based on this um, yeah, human psychological dynamics combined with scientific dynamics. So Wilbur has this model, and so when I say Wilbur's model, um, trying to think what the best way to go about this is. Um, so the Wilbur model is that there's a kind of evolution in consciousness, and that is what goes hand in hand with this evolution in political systems, um, that um, that results in liberalism, and now with this post-liberal kind of woke model, and possibly to something else. So why I want to say Wilbur's model and not the model of anybody else's. Lots of people have had this kind of idea of the evolution of consciousness, and Wilbur's heavily influenced by people like Sri Aurobindo, who's my main influence, and a lot of other people have also talked about evolution of consciousness. I think what the insight Wilbur brings to it is tying it specifically to the developmental psychology framework. So when I was first reading Wilbur, I didn't quite make this connection, but Wilbur has this kind of color chart of levels of consciousness going from these kind of primitive levels of consciousness to modern scientific consciousness to stages beyond modern scientific consciousness. So he draws this primarily from a literature of developmental psychology, which is this psychology discipline in the West, which claims to find these different levels of psychological developments. And they've supposedly been empirically tested among, different populations in the West. So I haven't engaged with this literature in depth, and I think that would be, yeah, it's a whole bunny trail, and for various reasons, I just haven't found it that compelling. To go into. But the defense of it is that, it's been scientifically validated in some certain sense, and there's a reason to give it credibility to think that there are these like different developmental stages. Um, so yeah, I and I'll explain Wilbur's connection before the reasons why I'm skeptical of it. So going by that logic, there's these different levels that in Wilbur's thinking corresponds to the different political stages that we're progressing through. So one of the psychological stages is this focus on kind of um, rational thought that does not necessarily take into consideration the other as strongly. And Wilbur maps that to um, the Enlightenment era, and that's I think the orange level. Um, so when people are first devising this idea that uh, everybody has equal rights and we should be rational and seek rational progress. That corresponds to a stage of psychological development, and that corresponds to a set of psychological ideas. Then there's a next level of psychological development where you start to be concerned with the development of others and start to have compassion for others more, and see that just as you have a certain right to develop yourself and have happiness, you also see that the other person has the same right, even if they're different from you, according to various demographic categories or whatever. And that corresponds to the green level of consciousness, and that's what started to be developed in the West in the 20th century, culminating in the kind of 1960s countercultural movement where people started to have, and the civil rights movement where people started to be able to see that, we need to give equal rights to these other people, and that's a psychological development that corresponds to political ideas. And then eventually there's this kind of yellow stage of integral thought where somehow that's all combined. Um, so the compelling thing about this is that there's this possibility that we're actually psychologically evolving and that our political ideas will track our psychological evolution. Um, and that is why we're seeing this tendency that's why the Enlightenment approach is not enough. Um, and it also it explains nicely some of these splits in the political side. So the Democrats are kind of split between they used to have this very strong modernist wing, and they were split between modernism and the Green Wave, and now they're largely green, and also have a little bit of modernism left over from the establishment. So they're this kind of tension between, like you're saying, this European Eurocentric version of the Enlightenment combined with this post-compassionate woke model of the Greens, and then possibly shading to integral, and the Republicans are kind of stuck at this orange level with a lot of the more kind of in Ken Wilber's model, their lower stages that are more regressive and or traditional in certain ways, and that's the often decried kind of racist or patriarchal aspects of human psychology, which are viewed as this like lower developmental level in this scheme. Um, so the problem I have with this is it is insightful. Like you say, oh, okay, well the Democrats are at this stage between orange and green, and they have this conflict that you're mentioning, but it's a little bit too neat for me. Like, do we? and that very neatness is what drives my skepticism. Um, so another thing is another reason to be to, so this kind of tech right thing is another example of why this makes me skeptical. So like a well-developed tech executive um who's kind of curious about the Republican side, um are they uh at the orange level and therefore at a lower level of psychological development than a college student who's protesting for for anti-racism or whatever? Probably not. They're actually probably at a um they might be at the yellow integral level of being able to synthesize multiple levels of psychological developments. Um, so it's not so clear cut to me, and especially the stages beyond green. When I look around at the people in the kind of cultural landscape who seem very well developed to me psychologically, I actually see them in different directions. So it's true that Trump the Trump base is probably on the whole at this kind of lower Wilbur stage than the Democratic base as a whole. The people at the kind of leading edges that are actually beyond the green levels have a quite diverse range of political views in in my estimation. There's people who are very insightful coming from the left and people who are very insightful coming from the right. So there's not this natural development that like, oh yeah, after this kind of woke stage, there's this natural development of some sort of integral political theory that unites everything. They're actually yeah, very different sets of ideas that so that to me undermines this connection between political ideas and psychological development that Wilbur wants to draw. So if we're saying, oh yeah, like this certain psychological stage is orange where you really like science and that corresponds to Enlightenment rationalism, that is a neat categorization and it illuminates well the difference between Enlightenment thinking and kind of woke thinking or uh, green based thinking or civil rights based thinking. That's a useful categorical distinction that yields insights. But the if the if the link between psychological developments and political theories breaks down at this leading edge, that calls into question what exactly is the cause of the link between psychological development and political theories at the earlier stages as well. If there's no natural um, uh, conditions, and there's some interesting examples of what I mean by this thing of people at different levels of psychological development and political thinking. And I don't want to call anybody out because these are generally not public figures, but just people I see in the landscape who and you don't want to diagnose people's levels of psychological development on a yeah
Yeah,
it gets very thorny territory, but yeah
it doesn't seem
this
very nice, you know.
yeah this these the, these connections are a little bit too neat, but at the same time they're insightful, so I haven't quite figured out how to square that in my yeah in my toolbox of thinking. But um yeah, so I'm curious on your take on this presentation, because I think there are yeah there's I also don't like the I think ideas have their own autonomy, and it's dangerous to link them to psychological levels without respecting the ideas themselves. But yeah, I'll stop there, and I'm curious what you think about this,
Yeah,
Lex.
I think I I've often I think there's something really great about Wilbur. Obviously, he's a really brilliant thinker. Um, and I think precisely because he's trying to his main project is the same project as Isaiah Berlin in a way. right? Where Berlin, I think, has probably, we have no idea how to combine the Enlightenment and the Romantic. We're just struggling with it. And I think Wilbur kind of inspired by Aurobindo, I suspect, right? Like Aurobindo, sort of tried to combine them in a spiritual context of the growth of human consciousness. Sort of saying, look, we need to sort of, the tension is not intrinsic to human psychology. It's internal to a certain stage of human psychology. And that if we can sort of grow psychologically, um, and which is fundamentally a personal project. It's not like, we can sort of just teach people this, right? But that people, there's a certain level of things that you can learn through schools, that you can learn through, YouTube videos or whatever. But at a certain point, this tension between the Enlightenment and the Romantic, the rational and the subconscious, uh, that kind of tension, the battlefield of that tension is each individual's own psyche. And that is where that battle is fundamentally fought. And one of the reasons why, and I think this is what I take from Aurobindo, and I think this is sort of what I think thinkers like Wilbur, I think, are articulating, is it is a kind of category mistake to think that this is a battle to be fought in the cultural domain, uh, fundamentally, in the first instance, right? It's not something that you fight by trying to defeat the Republican or defeat the Democrat. And if you can defeat them, then the right way of life will be preserved, because the tension is actually inside us. And so at a certain point, we have to sort of start to address that internal tension, right? And I see that's where I see that the woke or the Trump MAGA side are really resisting that idea, right? Because both the right and the left in that dimensions don't want they don't express how much a lot of the tensions are internal to our individual psyches. They want to externalize it. They want to say it's something on the other side that's doing it. For all, Trump has many, I think, features which make me think that, yeah, I can understand why people vote for him. Introspective is not one of them, right? That's whatever things that I cannot imagine that is one of the things that he's sort of charismatic about. And I think Wilbur is right. That is, in a way, though, that where we have to sort of fight this battle. But I think a lot of the gradations and the colors and all of this kind of stuff seems to me just too pat and too easy. Like he's just trying to combine all sorts of different things into one picture. And I'm much more drawn to somebody like Gray here, who just sort of say, look, we have no idea how all this will play out. Right? There are just many, many different domains that are happening. There is a domain of personal meaning. There's a domain of politics, business, technology, entertainment, and there is sort of, and then there is sort of our myth-making, meaning-oriented dimension of us. To think that all of these kind of map on to each other in one uber framework, which is, I think, which is what Wilbur's sort of main project has been. I think that strikes me as just way too sort of, it's like trying to turn spirituality into a science, is how it strikes me. And I just sort of think, no, this is gibberish. But like a lot, that's my gut instinct. My gut instinct, most of this is gibberish. He's this brilliant guy who's sort of articulating his political views through his spiritual views that get coded. And even this thing about our Trump supporters somehow lower on the level of cosmic consciousness where we're going to get. That just strikes me as absurd. I think I really want to get away from that kind of way of thinking, not reinforce it in the spiritual dimension. I want to try to get away from it as a Democrat, let alone now install it into a spiritual dimension, which is supposed to help us get beyond that, and so, yeah, is a 20-year-old um, liberal student somehow more enlightened than a 20-year-old Trump supporter? I mean, I think that to me, this is sort of that is I can't imagine the answer is yes, just based on the views that they have, which have a lot to do with circumstance and all sorts of other things. So I would sort of try to sort of my instinct has been to stay away from that side of Wilbur, but to ask with Wilbur, yes, we're not only political creatures. Yes, we're not only scientific creatures. We are There are other dimensions of us. Uh, in a way, for most people, I think most people are not political or scientific. That's not where most people are. That's not what they think about. Those are not the categories in which they think. They're sort of trying to figure out how to have a good life, how to balance family, career, meaning, and yes, how to be in a good society. But they're somehow their focus is sort of their life in some particular way and and I think they experience a lot of the stuff that happens kind of like chaos that they're trying to keep at bay. You could be a leftist or a rightist, and you're just trying to be like, can we have that be somehow reasonable so that we can pursue our passions in the way that we want? Um, and I think I see Trump as a positive force to sort of say, yes, there is this other dimension besides politics and science that is crucial to us. And I think that's what people are drawn to, frankly. If I sort of say, what is it that Trump has that Kamala Harris didn't have, right? At the root heart, even though I voted for Harris, my gut instinct is because America could not have handled what it would be to have Kamala Harris personality front and center. And maybe she's not even inclined to do that. I don't think she's inclined to speak from her expertise as a district attorney, as a politician. um, you know um, Whereas, and that doesn't, I think we want to be okay, yes, but what are we as a person, just brutally as a person? And I think that is a healthy thing. I think we want to retain that dimension. But how to do that, we don't want to be defined by politics. We don't want to be defined by what is the latest scientific journal saying about psychology. I don't want to be defined by Ken Wilber's Matrix either, right? And so, how do we create ways of relating to each other that can sustain that talking about that dimension of us, right? And I think that's kind of where we're at. Is maybe it's not so much. Do we the fear is something like, oh, if we don't have liberalism, is it going to be chaos, which is a fear, or is it just going to lead to some kind of, I saw this term, techno feudalism, right? Is it going to go back to a sort of world where we just have this kind of technological overlords that we gravitate towards? The right will have their techno overlords, and the left will have their techno overlords, and it'll sort of be a clash of this kind of of these visions. Or can we somehow retain some semblance of culture that can connect people, right? And I think that's kind of what I think is a real big issue here is, to what extent are we political creatures? To what extent are we scientific creatures? And what kind of creatures do we want to be? Right. And I think this cannot be decided by it's not going to be decided by psychology departments in universities, but it's also not going to be decided by, Ken Wilber or Eckhart Tolle or the Dalai Lama, or the Pope. let alone by Fukuyama or Kant or Wittgenstein or, Gray. I think Gray is sort of very aware of like, I am not going to be able to decide any of this. It's too complex. I like that about him. He's just kind of like, it's very complex. There are lots of things happening. We just need to try to balance these things as much as we can. And uh, and I think we can find interesting allies and interesting connections that can cut across right, left, political, apolitical, scientific, artistic, entertainment, academic. All of these boundaries can kind of merge in all sorts of interesting, fascinating ways, um, which I think is what really right now Trump, Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy, these guys are kind of, I think, more at the cutting edge of this blurring of categories. And so the challenge is how do we blur without becoming chaotic or without destroying the system in a certain important way? Because now the Democrats are the traditional conservatives, right? In the sense that the Democrats are like, hey, we want to make changes piecemeal. We don't want, no, we don't want necessarily an Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy coming in and be like slashing departments left and right just because, that's what they think is right. We want the changes to be incremental. So, but there's something really, so how we can combine these things, I think that's kind of where we're at, and I think that does require bringing philosophy, spirituality, human potential movements, transformation movements, putting politics into that category, right? Putting it into that dimension and seeing it from that perspective and sort of trying to understand it from there is, I think, very compelling. My own guess, this is sort of my gut instinct, is one of the reasons why Trump resonates, I think, is that I think he never apologizes, right? He never apologizes. And in a certain way, that has been the main message of the self-help movement for the last 60 years, right? Which is, you know, don't be defined, even not even 50, 60 years. If one goes back to, I often think, like Emerson famously said, sort of sticking, sort of don't be defined by what you used to think. Embrace contradictions. Don't worry about it, right? Don't worry about what you said 2 days ago. Feel free to change your mind. A foolish inconsistency is the hobgoblin of little minds or something like this, right? Like that idea that focus on yourself. Don't be defined by other people. Don't be defined by what they say about you. This is the kind of thing that Democrats are super triggered by when they feel that Trump gets away with this, right? But in a certain way, that has been the message of rock and roll music. That has been the message of the the liberal culture for the last 50 years is don't trust the establishment, don't trust other people's definition of you, be yourself, don't listen to their negative thoughts about you, right? And which, from a spiritual point of view, those are all really good points, you know? And so I think we have to sort of have, to me, that's the sense in which I feel hopeful. It's like, yes, if I see from that angle, that is kind of, we're headed in that direction of how do we hold on to that? We somehow want to hold on to that without also, you know, all the hatred and the sort of uh, other negative things that I think, unfortunately, all this, you know, things that, blaming the media and saying it's okay if they get killed and all this other stuff, that the anger that comes with that, right? How can one be not listen to other people, be yourself, don't let the liberals define you. Great. Can you do that while being positive and loving to the liberals. And same for the liberals. Can they do that actually? Right? That I think is a spirit is a sort of a spiritual question that I would love for that to be the way in which we talk about a lot of these issues. And I think Wilbur is pointing in that direction, but then all this stuff about gradations and colors and levels, I feel just are like a big break. Put a break on all of that because now I have to get into his framework, and that just sort of feels like a power trip. It's like, why do I have to define everything through Ken Wilber's sort of categories, you know? And so that we want to sort of somehow have that conversation without necessarily saying, I don't want to be defined by Wilber or Wittgenstein or, you know, anybody else. And let's just have the conversation. Let's just people talk to each other. That's kind of my instinct.
Hmm. Um, yeah, I think there's uh this real contradiction in the Democrats becoming the establishment party when, for like you're saying, the last um 60 years since the 60s, it's been kind of defined exactly in this opposite direction of critiquing the establishment. And so then you get to this thing where somehow you're still wanting to put the other people as the establishment, still even as you're kind of becoming the establishment, and just not really believing that you're the establishment, and seeing the establishment as somewhere else. So I think that's a contradiction that they'll have to work out. Going back to some of your earlier points, I think this gets to, I think one of the dimensions of this whole conversation that is really salient, which is the multi-directionality, the multi-dimensionality of evolution. So just um, we want to think that there is evolution, therefore it must be a straight line. But actually, evolution there is evolution, but it goes in many different directions, and it's kind of hard to predict. Like you're saying, it's not going to be controlled by the psychology departments or by the Dalai Lama, or anybody else that wants to be able to kind of put uh, a fixed location on it. And this is what Sri Aurobindo wrote about in the Human Cycle, that the movements of the life force of humanity are really unpredictable and can't and always exceed the maps of the mind, in a really dynamic way. And that's why he was skeptical of the project of scientific control of life and scientific ordering of society, that would ultimately be the solution that we get to, and ultimately skeptical of the kind of Enlightenment project. And he sees the something that the next stage is being something that will include the best parts of that, keep the rationality, but at the same time transcend that to a level that um, yeah, includes the spiritual dimension as well. But this multidimensionality of evolution, I think it explains why this myth of this idea of progress didn't happen as everybody expected it to. Um, so there's this idea that because there's evolution and progress, it has to go according to the ways that our minds um, would like them to. So we look at history and see that there's this kind of notion of progress, and then we think that okay, the next stage of progress has to look like what I map it to. So the things that I like are this kind of establishment view. We're going to keep, we're going to manage the deficit. We're going to do welfare well. All the other countries are going to kind of fall in line with the United States world system. And then in 2016, this thing happened that countered that narrative of what progress would look like, and it didn't. It exceeded the map of what the establishment idea or plan was for what that next stage of progress would be. Um, So it's it's to say that that is necessarily a reactionary counter to progress is actually kind of making the same fallacy um, as thinking that we're going in the direction of progress. It's neither. Uh, it's if we give up on this idea that progress is a linear thing, then it's no longer a reaction against progress, but just a different direction that of human potentials that need to be explored. Um, so scientific ordering of life and compassion are two great values that we need more of, but they're not the only values that exist um, in the human domain. Um, so there are all these different potentials, different cultural potentials, different potentials of values being developed, different potentials of the human psychology that can be developed, and some of them might correspond to the color chart, where if I am more empathetic in this way, then I score higher on the developmental psychology score. But there are other different capacities that I might develop that have nothing to do with the score that they're measuring on that chart. Um, so I do think there is a logic uh to the way things develop, but it's it's not a linear one. It's not one um that can be easily contained by our maps. And it requires a real subtlety to see exactly is being brought out of the um, of the kind of massive potentials. What is it that is going to be brought out next? It's not necessarily going to be the thing that kind of goes with the straight line map of progress. There might be other things that we need to recuperate and kind of go back and further develop this stage or this thing that wasn't fully developed yet. Um, and I think the that's what's missing from this kind of establishment view that we can just go on this plan, tell everybody what to do according to our scientific expertise, and everybody's going to fall into line with that. And I think that's a big part of the reaction against um yeah, that that force of kind of the life force reacting against that plan is one of the things that has kind of derailed what the establishment saw as the next stage of progress. Uh, but yeah, it's not just one direction. It's not um, necessarily going to go in the direction that we anticipate. So the question is that what do we do with that knowledge if we can't kind of control it in a way that we would like? Um, and uh, I think that's the value of the idea of progress, because we still need to have this idea of what the next stage of progress is for us, or what's the next constructive thing that we can do to keep things moving forward. Um, it just doesn't necessarily look like um, so if you value compassion, if you value scientific rationality, you still work to continue those things in the next thing that you construct. But you take into consideration the other things that are brought out of the soup of potentials, and see what might be relevant there to construct your next stage of progress. And I think that's what the Democrats have a chance to do now. They have a chance to see how people react to the vision that they were putting forward, see what people don't like about it, and kind of construct the next stage of what progress might look like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly right. I think the Democrats now have a chance to, I mean, I think it's a seesaw. I mean, I think now, with sort of Trump back in the presidency, yes, it's going to be now a lot of questions about what's he going to do, what did work, what doesn't work, and so forth. But the Democrats have a chance to rethink a lot of things, and I think, my own sort of, I guess, my own wish is that, that Democrats or, anti-Trumpers in general, even Trump supporters. My wish is that we all can rethink some of these questions. That I don't think that who can have this conversation with whom should be divided along the lines of who you voted for. I think this is a chance to just keep developing a conversation for what how do we share meaning with each other? How do we create meaning? How do we share meaning with each other? And I think politics is one way we do that. And I think the getting back to the question of what are the limits of liberalism, and I think this is where I think Fukuyama is maybe his view misses something, right? Which is that, you know, yes, there is a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Sort of want food and so forth, and then highest up is self-realization. Um, but and so one can think of, well, a liberal democracy is something that is sort of trying to get the basic things to everybody. And then the higher level things can be left to each person to pursue for themselves. And this is kind of, I think, is a very attractive picture. If we can just sort of get people to have driver's licenses and, social security and, healthcare and all these kinds of basic needs, then yeah, everybody figure out on their own what kind of things they want for their personal, meaningful life. Um, but in a way, it's the meaning that's first, because that's kind of what drives our sense of identity and so forth. So I think if we can sort of have those conversations and make politics almost secondary to those conversations, then I think that might be the best way to hold on to liberalism, right? It's not to aim for it too directly, but to sort of try to have the conversations that we want to have as people, and let the institutional stuff follow off of that. It's challenging because it might not it might have we then can't predict what the institution will look like, and we might have to sort of lean into that uncertainty a little bit, to have that.
Hmm. Yeah. Cool. I think that was a great last set of comments. Did you have any final comments, or just trying to think if I have any conclusions. Um,
Yeah, I guess maybe I'll just say one last thing that occurs
mm,
to me. I think even though I don't resonate with Wilbur's particular way of framing it, I think there is a broad story that I do resonate with, which is that which sees the rise of democratic societies in the last 300, 400 years as an unfolding of a historical rise of consciousness among human beings. Right. So in that sense, I would like the political, I'm drawn to the idea of putting the politics within a broader framework of human growth. Right. Now, what the connection is between the politics and the growth, what the growth looks like, what the politics will look like, I think these are all murky. We cannot easily say what any of that, like you're saying about Arabind, we cannot easily map all of that, right? But I think there is a kind of gradation of, you know, sort of 10,000 years ago, we didn't even really have agriculture as a human species, right? And until 300 years ago, before the Industrial Revolution, most people were we were living on sort of some kind of farming-based societies, right? And so there is such a lot of change has happened over the span of less than 500 years, in which a lot of people who, frankly, wouldn't even have a voice in society, are coming to having a voice, right? And to thinking and to analyzing and to sort of feeling like they're not defined by their physical labor or by their sort of their status at birth or their whatever, but that they can sort of have some kind of a a creative energy and will in society. This is radically new if we think about it in the big picture of things. We kind of tend to take it for granted. And so I think the most optimistic, hopeful side of me says, if we think about it that way, then we're kind of in our infancy as a species that is trying to have a gigantic conversation among people. In America, 350 million people, 8 billion people around the world. And so all of the tumult and the unpredictableness is not so crazy when seen in that light. And maybe that can be something that can help us have conversations more with each other.
Mm. Yeah, I think the possibility of the end of liberalism is goes exactly with the fear that we could lose those things that you're talking about, this kind of society where we don't where people have opportunities regardless of their status of birth, where people have the ability to express themselves, freely express themselves through
Yeah,
freedom
definitely.
of
That is the
choices.
tension. That's the tension there.
And
Yeah.
that's the concern that uh like the possibility you mentioned of techno-feudalism coming on, I think is one of the real dangers of the coming society. And I think there are tendencies from both the left and right where that could come about. Um, but that
But
might be
it's worth highlighting that even the techno-feudalism, we're not going back to the actual feudalism, right? Because I think that part of the way that even in the technical feudalism it would work is that there has to be some sense that people can express themselves. But maybe the control will come in all sorts of other ways, right? But I don't think the genie is out of the bottle of that people get to have ideas and opinions, right? What we're seeing now is that people can have ideas that maybe there are ways that can be suppressed, maybe there are ways that can be ignored, right? Maybe it's inundated with bullshit, so we can't actually have a conversation, whatever, right? There are all sorts of other ways, but the very act that a person gets to have a voice, I think that is going to be that could be suppressed, and that will, I'm sure people will try to suppress it, but they're trying to suppress on the left and the right? But the suppression already presupposes that there is an affirmation to have the voice, whereas 500 years ago most people I don't think would even have thought that that is the voice that they get to have. They have to just do their work and leave the voice to the kings or to the bishops or to whoever are the people in charge, you know. And for them, the most they can do is maybe control their family or control, their local, and mostly men control, right? The idea that suddenly, no, you get to have a voice. You have a thing as a voice, right? That I think is already to me a sign of a higher unfolding of consciousness, because people have to recognize that they first have a voice to ask themselves, what direction do I want to go with my voice, right? Then they can ask, do I want to go in this direction, that direction? Do I want to go in an inner direction to raise my consciousness? So they first need to feel that they have a choice, that they have agency to then exercise their higher agency, right? And that's the sense in which I think things are moving. Whether Where this will go, it's hard to tell. I mean, we could all blow up, and there could be a nuclear war, and so that's the worry. It's that anything could. None of this is written into nature. That it is going to happen somehow. We just have to. Don't worry about it. That's not the kind of thing, right? Yeah, there's a lot of things to worry about. But part of the agency we have is maybe we can try to figure out how to relate to our worries. All the worries we have, how should we think about it? It's like enlightenment isn't the absence of worries or pain or fears. It's something else. It's how to deal with all of those things. And maybe we can, as a society and species, have those conversations and then fit science and politics and everything else, even entertainment, family, into that broader set of expansive conversation.
Mm. Yeah, that might be a good place to wrap up then.
Yeah, yeah. Did you have any last thing you wanted to say?
Um, hmm. No, just I think the main thing that I was still um thinking about was this concept that yeah, I agree that there's this concept of progress in nature is what I came into this conversation thinking about, and your last comment maybe thinking about it again. So I do believe in a kind of divine unfolding, but I don't believe it unfolds according to the ideas of the mind. So there are no structures um, that guarantee that it's going to unfold according to our ideological preferences. Uh, there's a greater divine wisdom, but it doesn't look like a bar chart going from left a graph looking going from um, going straight up in one direction towards kind of establishment thinking or any other kind of ideological thinking. Um, so I think that's the main takeaway that it's going to unfold, but it unfolds according to a lot of different potentials that are coming up out of the soup um of the unconscious and the manifestation. Um, yeah, so that it's not the not progress according to our ideological conceptions, but an unfolding according to something else.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And maybe, yeah, good point to end on. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Well, yeah, thanks for this discussion. It was really interesting. A lot of great points.
Yeah. Thank you. I enjoyed it a lot. So great talking.
Yeah, great. Bye.